There are many different options when it comes to choosing what seed starting mix you use. Are you going to purchase it, or are you going to make it yourself? Are you going to include compost? Are you going to make it soilless? Are you going to use just a basic potting mix? It's up to you, and the choices are endless. One thing is certain, whether you're planning to start seeds for the spring, summer, or fall in southern Arizona, the first thing that you need to decide on to get off to a good start is what seed starting mix you plan to use. In gardening circles, you may have heard the term soil media when it comes to the kind of soil you're growing your plants in. Soil media provides three different things. It holds moisture, it provides adequate drainage, and it's a fine enough texture to allow tiny new roots to move through as they grow and develop. As I said, there are many different seed starting mixtures available. You can purchase them from garden centers. However, when you look at the volume of soil that you're getting when you purchase those, they can be quite expensive, and they vary in quality from brand to brand. It is very easy to mix your own seed starting mixture and very inexpensive when compared with purchasing it at a garden center. I'm going to share with you the 3-ingredient seed starting mix plus one bonus ingredient that I've had success with. Before we get started, I want to caution you about using garden soil to start your seeds indoors with. And when I first heard this recommendation, I thought, why? Haven't seeds been growing in garden soil outdoors for millennia? And of course, the answer to that question is yes. However, if you're starting seeds indoors, keep in mind that that is a very unnatural environment for seeds to germinate in. They're away from insects, wind, rain, natural sunlight, and all of the beneficial microbes that are in the soil outdoors. Keep in mind that garden soil can have diseases and pests in it, and that can have negative effects on your seedlings. If you're putting garden soil in containers inside, it may hold too much water and be too heavy for those new tiny roots to move through. It's best to start with seed starting mixes for the best outcome possible. All right, let's talk about the elements that make a good seed starting mix. The first one is texture. If you've ever looked at regular potting mix or compost, it's got a lot of large chunks in it, and those large pieces of material can make it hard for those tiny roots to move through the media and grow outward. It also needs to be free of soil clumps and twigs so that it doesn't obstruct the seedling's way to breaking the surface. Seed starting mixes need to be loose to allow for the presence of air pockets, as well as light enough to provide good water drainage. New seedlings are going to have a lot of trouble moving through wet, heavy material. Seed starting mixes need to be sterile, and it may seem counterintuitive that many seed starting mixes are actually soilless, which I will explain in just a minute, but those seed starting mixes are sterile and they ensure that there are no pathogens or diseases or pests present. You want to get your little seed babies off to a great start, and they do not need to be fighting pests and diseases when they're on their way to becoming grown-up seeds. I want to talk about peat moss for just a minute and why I don't use peat moss in my seed starting mix or anywhere else in my garden. Peat moss is harvested for gardens and nurseries because it retains moisture but also allows good drainage, which are two really important elements for growing healthy plants. Peat moss is harvested from bogs all over the world, and this peat moss has sequestered carbon from the environment for thousands of years. And if this peat moss is harvested, it's going to release that carbon back out into the atmosphere, which is harmful for the environment. It also disrupts natural habitats for insects, reptiles, small mammals, and birds. So finding an alternative to peat moss in our gardening activities is very important to maintain a healthy ecosystem. Instead of using peat moss, I use coco coir, which I will talk about in detail in just a minute. All right, with all of that housekeeping out of the way, here is the recipe. My basic seed starting mix is 4 quarts of coconut coir, 2 quarts of vermiculite, and 1 quart of horticultural sand or builder's sand. If you're going to be using coconut coir instead of peat moss, I would recommend looking for the finest textured coconut coir that you can find. Some of them are pretty rough in texture, so you want a much finer texture if you can find it. Likewise, with the sand, you want to try to find one that is fine enough, but not as fine as play sand. And then for the vermiculite, I have also chosen a very fine product. Now this can be very fine or it can be very coarse, but you want to try to find a nice fine product if you can. When you look at the texture of this, you can see there are some chunks that are a little bit bigger, but that's mostly made up of uniformly fine particles. So this is much coarser than play sand, but not as coarse as some of the grit that you can get in the garden center. You want to look when you're trying to pick out your horticultural sand for something of similar size as this. Once you get your ingredients together, measure them out and mix them together in a bucket or other large container. Then, because your seedlings aren't going to like getting started in dry soil, add water. I will either get my watering can or the sprinkler wand for the hose and add water, mix it, wet it, and repeat until the mixture is moist but not dripping. Think of it like wetting a dish rag and then wringing it out, but it isn't dripping, it's just moist. Once the mixture has absorbed the water, spread it into your seedling trays and you're ready to plant. This is the seed starting mix that I've ended up with, and as you can see, it is very fine, very fluffy and soft, but it's also retaining moisture, but not too much. Coconut coir is often used in hydroponics gardening. It is the husk of coconuts, the brown material in between the white meat that people like to eat and the green shell. Coconut coir retains moisture just like peat moss does so that your seedlings don't dry out, but it's also light and airy enough so that it doesn't cause damping off. What is damping off? Damping off can prevent your seedling from ever emerging because it can cause your seed to rot before it ever germinates. If you've ever seen a seedling that looks like the stem is pinching off right above the soil line and then it just tips over and just dies, that is damping off. Another benefit of using coco coir is that it is sterile, so you don't have to worry about diseases and pathogens. Vermiculite is a naturally occurring mineral with a very long name: magnesium, aluminum, iron, silicate. Vermiculite is mined in countries all over the world and is heated to a very high temperature until it expands. Vermiculite will improve nutrient and water retention. It will cause the soil to have a very light and airy texture, which of course will protect those tiny little roots. When you're shopping for your vermiculite and your coconut coir, make sure you get the finest texture you can find because that is going to be the best media for those roots to move through. Another really important ingredient is sand, and the reason that you add sand is because it's going to improve drainage of your soil media. If you've ever purchased a potted plant from a garden center, I'm sure that you've seen in the soil the white, puffy, really light, airy stuff. That is perlite. I actually prefer not to use perlite. I use sand instead, and that's because I find as you're watering your soil, that perlite tends to work its way to the top because it's lighter than all of the other ingredients, and then you find that it's sitting at the top, which means that it's not actually doing its job down below. Now, a word about sand. It is not all created equally. If you think that you can go out and steal sand from your child's sandbox, don't do that because play sand is a much finer texture and it's more likely to clump up rather than mixing uniformly with the rest of the ingredients in your soil mixture. When you're looking for sand, purchase horticultural sand from a garden center or builder's sand from a hardware store. Make sure that you get a fine textured sand, but not as fine as play sand. When it comes to sand, we're talking about the Goldilocks syndrome. We don't want it too fine and we don't want it too coarse. We want it just right. The next ingredient I want to talk about is an optional extra ingredient. You don't have to use it. I have done both. I've used it and I've not used it, and I've gotten great results either way, so don't feel like it's something that you have to run out and buy. So this next additional optional ingredient is superphosphate. Before I address why I add superphosphate to my mix, I want to talk about the 3 numbers on the front of the fertilizer bags. Those are N, P, K, and those are the ratios of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the fertilizer. N is nitrogen, and nitrogen encourages the growth of healthy foliage. P is the ratio of phosphorus in the soil. Phosphorus is important for healthy root development. Later on in the plant's life, it's also important for fruit development. K is the ratio of potassium in the fertilizer mix, and it's important for flowering, fruiting, and fruit ripening. Since we just did a rundown of what phosphorus does for plants, I bet you know why I add it to the soil. That's right, adding superphosphate to the soil media will help encourage robust root development of our little seedlings so that they can grow up big and strong and move out of the house one day to their own little garden plot. Of course, it's your choice to add or not add superphosphate to your mix. If you decide not to, your seedlings are still going to grow really well with a couple of tips that I have coming right up. Of course, we are all operating within different resources, and so if you are in a position where you have to use what you have on hand, then that is better than nothing. I have started seedlings with potting mix successfully. I've planted my seedlings outdoors successfully. The only two things that I really have had poor results with is using garden soil inside to start my seeds in, as well as compost. So try to avoid those two things. If you need to use some sort of an alternative besides seed starting mix, I would recommend trying to sift it through a sieve to remove those extra chunks and twigs and things that can be hard for seedlings to grow through. Here's what I do. I take a bucket and I've got this sieve that I use to sift my soil through to remove any of the big chunks. I use this with the compost that I make at home as well as with any kind of a store-bought mix that I'm using, and I find that if I have any bark chunks or any large objects that I need to remove, this works really well. I ordered this on Amazon. It's just a soil sieve. I take my bucket, I put my sieve right on top of it, and then I will take the soil that I need to use or the compost and I will just run it through it. Now, as you can see, all of those large chunks of perlite and the bark is going to be left in the sieve, and underneath will be the finer soil that this mix contains. Now, if you look at this, you can see that it still has a few bigger chunks, but it's much better than the product that I started with. So in a pinch, if I have to use this, this will work too. There was one other question that kept bugging me when I first started learning about how to make my own seed starting mix. And that is, if you're using coconut coir, vermiculite, and sand, there really aren't any nutrients in it. How is it that the seeds can germinate and grow and flourish in an environment with very few nutrients? Well, to answer that question, we need to talk very basically about some seed anatomy. A seed is made of three different parts: the seed coat, which protects the interior of the seed from all of the harsh elements outside, the seed embryo, which will become our little baby seedling, and the endosperm. The endosperm will provide nutrients to the seed until its root system is developed enough to obtain nutrients from the soil, and when its leaves are able to photosynthesize. Once your seedling is about 3 weeks old, that endosperm has probably given all that it has, and so to ensure that our seedling continues to develop in a healthy way, it's great to add a liquid dilute fertilizer once a week so that it grows up big and strong. Now, this fertilizer needs to be a balanced fertilizer, and if you remember from past videos, a balanced fertilizer is one that has very similar numbers on the front of the bag or the back of the bag for NPK. So maybe it's 10, 10, 10, for example. Whether you choose an organic or synthetic fertilizer is up to you. Organic fertilizers are made from substances obtained from plants and animal sources, and the nutrient concentrations will vary from brand to brand. There's also some variability in how quickly or slowly those nutrients are released. So if you're using an organic fertilizer, which is what I'm using, just be on the lookout for any nutrient deficiencies. Synthetic fertilizers are made from petroleum products, and so their nutrient concentrations are usually quite exact, and their release is very predictable. All right, now you are armed with everything that you need to build your own very inexpensive seed starting mix. I'll be releasing a follow-up video very soon about my seed starting setup. I'll be covering watering, I'll be covering lighting, I'll be covering how to sterilize your containers before you start planting your seeds, and all kinds of other things. So be on the lookout for that very soon. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Kara from Arizona. Until next time, happy gardening.